I'm Nora Bennett, 29, and the afternoon light had just turned the walls of my apartment the color of warm tea when I stopped in the doorway and forgot how to breathe. My sister stood in front of my mirror in the ivory satin I spent 3 months searching for fingers, smoothing fabric that wasn't hers to touch. The diamonds at her ears flashed like tiny stars my grandmother saved for my wedding day. I didn't speak right away. The air felt fragile, as if one word might shatter it. Behind me, a floorboard clicked, and I knew I wasn't imagining this. My parents were there, too quiet and watchful. The dress caught the sun and threw it back across the room. Somewhere under the thudding in my chest, a decision began to form. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to draw a line that no one believed you'd hold. I grew up in a small New England town where the grocery clerks knew your dog's name and the library smelled like pencil shavings in winter. We were taught to say, "Please return what we borrowed," and leave things better than we found them. My mother praised kindness, my father prized calm, and I learned early that being the steady one kept the household running, especially when my little sister's wants rushed in like weather. I found my place in fabrics and silhouettes, sketching dresses in the margins of school notes, later working my way into a styling studio where long racks of color felt like a second language. I made people feel seen, and that mattered to me. We never had more than we needed, but we had enough, and when I moved to the city for work, the elevator lobbies and glass offices felt like another planet. You carry your history with you into rooms like that, even when you think you've outgrown it. I told myself the pull between those worlds kept me balanced. Some days it did. Daniel is steady without being still. He reads contracts like stories and remembers to warm the car for me when it snows. We planned a simple ceremony with clean lines and a playlist we built over takeout dinners, the kind of wedding you can picture clearly because it looks like your life only lit softly at the edges. When we set a date, my grandmother Evelyn pressed my hands and said, "Let it be yours," and I tucked that sentence somewhere safe. The contrast between our careful plans and my family's habits showed up in small ways at first. Kayla borrowing my best heels for a party and returning them scuffed my favorite purse, coming back with a lipstick shadow I couldn't lift. I kept telling myself those were the usual bumps, nothing more. I wanted the peace I'd been taught to keep. At the studio, I learned to solve last-minute disasters with a calm voice and a clean seam. It became a reflex to absorb a crisis so the client never felt the bruise. That reflex followed me home, where I brushed off Kayla's habit of testing boundaries and my parents' habit of excusing it because smoothing things over had a way of making the day easier for everyone. But there was a winter afternoon. I still think about the week I styled a key look for a senator's daughter, and an unexpected red stain bloomed on a jacket I had left hanging by the door. My boss didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The disappointment in the room was enough to leave a mark. I told myself it was just one mistake, and maybe it was. But the echo of it didn't fade. When Daniel and I started choosing vendors, I planned visits down to the minute, grateful for spreadsheets that asked nothing of me but accuracy. The city felt big and bright, and on good days, I could feel my shoulders drop as I stepped out of the train and into a life I'd made for myself, one fitting at a time. My grandmother would call most evenings with small questions about flowers or shoes, though I knew she was really checking the temperature of my voice. She has a way of hearing what you don't say. I kept our conversations light, saving the heavier details for later, the way you set a fragile dish on a towel and decide to wash it when you have both hands free. I wanted to believe we were past the old patterns. Hope can be a kind of habit, too. The week we finalized the cake, my parents announced they were stopping by without calling ahead, which for some families might be normal. But in our home, it was always a warning bell. They arrived with a leather-bound planner I'd never seen and a smile that promised changes. The pages were filled in a hand that wasn't mine. Daniel watched me the way people do when they know a current has started and they're measuring the distance to shore. I heard phrases I hadn't agreed to and saw my name beside ideas that didn't sound like us, and still I tried to meet them at the door with good manners. It's a curious thing how far politeness can stretch without tearing. That afternoon slid into the moment in my doorway, the light on satin, my sister's reflection bright as a marquee. Up close, I could see the careful tailoring at the waist and the way the skirt moved like it had found its person, and for a second, my heart tried to pretend this was a fitting nothing more. Then Kayla turned, and the room told the truth. My mother's chin lifted. My father's mouth set, and the diamonds at Kayla's ears threw off tiny storms against the glass. I felt every year of being the one who made space, and I also felt something else quieter but heavier, like a door inside me clicking shut. I stood there long enough to hear the building settle and the refrigerator hum in the kitchen, small sounds that made the rest of it sharper. My sister smiled like we were playing dress-up the way we did when we were kids with pillowcases for veils, and my parents waited for me to do what I'd always done. My hands were steady, which surprised me. The words weren't ready yet, but they were coming, and before the day was over, I would learn that the dress wasn't the only thing someone else had already claimed. The silence in my bedroom stretched until it felt heavy in my chest. Kayla's smile faltered when I told her to take off the dress, my voice steady, though my palms ached from clenching. She laughed like it was a joke, asking our mother to intervene, but I didn't waver. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes darting between us as if waiting for me to fold. I repeated myself slower this time, making it clear that the dress wasn't hers. For the first time I can remember, she unzipped something she wanted with her own hands instead of mine. The earrings followed cool and sharp as she dropped them into my palm. My parents' faces hardened, but I stood straighter, feeling a kind of calm I'd never known before. That night, I carefully hung the dress back in my closet, smoothing the fabric until it rested perfectly. I traced the zipper with my fingertips, my heart still racing, yet the weight in my chest had shifted into something firmer. For nearly 3 decades, I had been the one to compromise the daughter who stepped aside and made peace. But looking at that dress, I whispered a promise to myself that the habit ended here. They might glare, they might resent, but this day would belong to me and Daniel, not to anyone else. The next afternoon, Daniel and I sat across from each other on our worn gray sofa, a dozen bakery samples scattered on the coffee table between us. We finally decided on the honey lavender cake with buttercream frosting, a choice that made him smile with relief after weeks of tastings. He reached for my hand, rubbing small circles against my palm, reminding me we were 3 weeks away from becoming husband and wife. The sound of the doorbell startled us both. I checked my phone, but no one had been scheduled to come by. Daniel rose to answer, and moments later my parents stepped into our apartment without invitation, my mother holding a leather binder I didn't recognize. She laid it open on our table, covering our notes with glossy pages filled with handwriting that wasn't mine. My father hovered eyes roaming the furniture silently, measuring the cost of everything we owned. My mother spoke quickly, announcing they'd made small adjustments to perfect the day. Daniel sat back down beside me, his jaw tight, but he kept his hand steady against mine. My mother turned to a page labeled Bridal Party and pointed to a line I hadn't written. Next to my name was another bold and underlined Kayla Bennett co-bride. She flipped again, showing sketches of matching gowns, identical jewelry, and notes about shared moments during the ceremony. My stomach dropped. Daniel leaned forward, reminding her there was no such thing as a co-bride, that this wasn't some European trend. But my parents dismissed his words as if he were a guest in the room. I told them plainly it wasn't happening. My voice calm, even as the air felt sharp around us. When they finally left, promising to discuss further, I sat at our laptop and searched through emails. Dozens of messages appeared, all between my mother and the venue, none including me. Special instructions had been given, requests for 2 bridal suites, balanced photo opportunities, equal attention to both daughters. I called Daniel over, and together we read in disbelief as the words confirmed what my aunt had once whispered about. They'd been planning this behind my back for months. My phone buzzed with a new notification. Kayla had posted a picture on social media, standing in my altered after-party dress, the caption calling it her final fitting for our sister ceremony. Strangers congratulated her, confused relatives asked what it meant. I felt the blood rush to my ears as I stared at the screen. Within the hour, the phone calls began. My Aunt Ruth reached me first, her voice unsure as she asked whether I really wanted this unusual arrangement. I explained as best I could, though words hardly covered the betrayal. More calls followed from cousins, family, friends, even distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. Each one repeated the same question: why was I making my sister a co-bride? Every conversation carried the same undertone. They thought it was my choice, that I was the one erasing the lines. When I finally confronted my mother on the phone, her voice carried a familiar sweetness laced with steel. "You've always been the strong one, Nora," she said. "Your sister needs this." My father's voice joined hers on the extension, reminding me that since they were paying half, they had a say in how the day unfolded. The pressure didn't stop with them. My cousin Denise sent messages urging me to be the bigger person. Uncle Robert called, suggesting I consider how much Kayla had been through after her last breakup. I scrolled through texts, each one tightening around me like a rope. In the middle of it all, only Aunt Ruth gave me the truth. She came to our apartment the next day, her voice low, as she admitted she'd overheard the plan at Christmas that my mother had ordered Kayla's gown the same week I ordered mine. She said it would be easier to ask forgiveness than permission. Aunt Ruth whispered, guilt heavy in her eyes. I pressed my hands against the counter for steadiness, the cool stone grounding me as the weight of it sank in. Later that week, I drove to see my grandmother at her assisted living community, where the halls smelled faintly of cinnamon and the walls carried soft family photographs. Sitting across from her in her modest apartment felt like stepping into a shelter. She took my hand in hers, her skin paper thin, but her grip steady. "This is your day, Nora," she said. "Not your sister's, not your mother's, yours." Her voice gave shape to what I already knew, but hadn't yet spoken aloud. When I left, I carried her words like armor. That evening, Daniel had our laptop open on the table again, spreadsheets pulled up with numbers that showed how we could cover the costs ourselves. He said we'd manage without their money, that it was worth it to have the day free from interference. Leah arrived soon after with a legal pad announcing she'd begun documenting every overstep and violation in case things escalated. My phone rang again, and this time it was my boss. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. He spoke gently, uncharacteristically so, after hearing about the double wedding from a client. I explained, halting embarrassed. He surprised me with his response, reminding me how much my sister had already cost us as a business, and warning me not to let her cost me this, too. The following night, a text arrived from my parents, sharp and final. Either include Kayla as co-bride or lose their financial support. The message carried reminders of family reputation and subtle threats about my grandmother's care. I stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, Daniel's arms wrapping around me as I whispered the truth. It wasn't about a dress anymore, it was about my whole life. And before long, Kayla would take the story public in a way none of us could ignore. 2 mornings after the ultimatum, I switched on the television in my kitchen and nearly dropped the mug in my hand. Kayla's tear-streaked face filled the local morning news segment. She spoke softly, telling the host how all she wanted was to share in her sister's special day and how I had threatened to cancel the wedding just to keep her from wearing a dress. The host leaned toward her with sympathy, never once asking what dress it was or whether she had my permission to wear it in the first place. I stood frozen as the story played, listening to her voice tremble while she spoke of sacrifice and rejection. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some told me to think about family first, others called me selfish. One of my cousins texted a short line that stung more than the rest. "Is it really such a big deal? I didn't answer any of them." The news clip had already been shared across social media, and the phrase "share with your sister" was appearing in posts from people I didn't even know. The phone rang again that afternoon. It was Aunt Carol, her voice heavy with judgment. "I raised you better than this, Nora," she said without greeting. She told me my mother was heartbroken and accused me of being dramatic. I asked if my mother had explained that she'd tried to make Kayla a co-bride, but Carol dismissed the thought immediately. She just wants both her daughters to shine, she said, as if that explained everything. When the call ended, I sat staring at the blank wall, the silence in the apartment pressing in on me. Later that day, a delivery arrived at my door, a stack of letters from my parents' church. The top one had already been opened, and the words inside cut sharper than I expected. It read simply, "Honor thy father and mother." I dropped the whole pile straight into the recycling bin. Still, the weight of those words stayed with me as I cleared the counter, reminding me how quickly people could turn when they only knew one side of the story. Work offered no relief. At the studio that Monday morning, I was arranging outfits for Valerie Torres, a client with a massive online following. My phone kept buzzing with new texts from my mother, father, and Kayla. I tried to ignore them, focusing on pinning the hem of Valerie's dress, but my hands shook. She studied me closely and asked if something was wrong. I told her everything was fine, though my voice betrayed me. She tilted her head and mentioned seeing the morning news clip, saying her followers were already talking about it. My heart sank. The private lines between my family's chaos and my professional world had been crossed. After Valerie left, Diana called me into her office. The video of Kayla's interview played silently on her computer screen, the closed captions making every word visible. Diana folded her hands and spoke with quiet firmness. "This needs to stay out of the studio. Clients come here for perfection, not family soap operas. Keep it together or take a leave of absence." I nodded quickly, promising it wouldn't be an issue, though I wasn't sure how to stop something already spiraling. That evening, I drove across town to see my grandmother at her small cottage. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of cinnamon and old books surrounded me, bringing a sense of calm I hadn't felt in days. She guided me to the sofa and waited until the tears came on their own. "They're making me the villain," I managed to say. I told her about the news segment, the letters from the church, and my boss's warning. She listened without interruption, her hand wrapped firmly around mine. Then she spoke words that made me sit up straighter. "Your mother did the same to her own sister," she said. My head jerked up in disbelief. She explained that at Louise's wedding, my mother had insisted on wearing white, demanded to stand beside the bride in photos, even tried to match the flowers. When Louise protested, my grandfather had taken my mother's side, and the sisters hadn't spoken since. The silence in the room deepened as I realized this wasn't a new story. It was a pattern stretching across generations. Grandma rose carefully and led me to her bedroom. At the foot of her bed sat a cedar chest. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing folded blankets, and beneath them a folder thick with documents. She handed it to me and told me to look at the deed first. My name was printed alongside hers as co-owner of her home, something she had arranged years earlier without telling me. Another set of papers showed the family trust where I was listed as executor of her estate. I stared at her confused, but she simply said she'd watched for years as my parents allowed Kayla to take whatever she wanted. This was her way of making sure they couldn't take everything. Her words carried no bitterness, only a quiet certainty. She told me I had the strength to protect myself now. The following morning, I met with a new wedding planner, one with no ties to my mother's social circle. Tasha's office was lined with photos of celebrations that looked nothing like the glossy perfection my parents craved. She asked me what I wanted, emphasizing the word. The answer came faster than I expected: security. Guards who would enforce the guest list, people who would step in if family tried to disrupt things. She nodded without hesitation. "We can arrange that," she said, writing notes with efficient strokes. That afternoon, Daniel's old college roommate Marcus arrived, laptop in hand. He now worked in IT security, and within an hour he had changed every password connected to our wedding. Vendor accounts, venue bookings, the photography portal, all were locked down with two-factor authentication. He looked up from the keyboard and promised my family wouldn't be able to make unauthorized changes again. Relief washed over me as I realized how much ground we had regained in a single day. I called the venue directly that evening and spoke with the manager instead of the coordinator my mother had befriended. I identified myself clearly as the bride and told her that any changes must come only from me or Daniel. She confirmed she would update the files immediately. After the call, I transferred money from my savings account to cover my parents' portion of the wedding costs. The confirmation email arrived in my inbox with a finality that loosened something in my chest. Their financial leverage was gone. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking to the sound of a buzzing phone. In the morning, I stood on the balcony with a cup of coffee as the sun came up. Daniel joined me, brushing a kiss against my hair. "You look different," he said quietly, and I felt different. I had spent years keeping peace by giving pieces of myself away, but now I was beginning to gather them back one boundary at a time. Some people might call it selfish. I knew it was survival. The phone stayed silent on the table inside, but I could feel a storm brewing beyond the quiet. Kayla and my parents would not let this go, and soon enough I would see just how far they were willing to push. The week after securing the vendors and paying off my parents' share, I felt an unusual calm in my chest. For the first time since our engagement, the day no longer felt like a negotiation. But the peace didn't last long. My parents invited me to dinner, saying they wanted to put the tension behind us. Daniel encouraged me to go, reminding me that sometimes quiet civility was easier than silence. I agreed, though I knew better than to expect the evening to pass without an agenda. The dining room smelled of pot roast and rosemary when I arrived. My mother's smile carried an edge of triumph. My father's tone practiced warmth. Kayla sat across from me, her expression guarded but smug. The food passed around the table with forced cheer until I spoke. "You were right," I said evenly, setting my fork down. "Family should come first." The silence that followed was sharp. My mother's eyes softened with satisfaction as she patted my hand, saying she was glad I finally understood. My father nodded, lifting his glass as if sealing a pact. Kayla leaned back, her eyes narrowing as if weighing how much to believe. I excused myself to the bedroom and asked Kayla to follow. She blinked in surprise when I offered her the ivory after-party dress again, suggesting we take photos for the memory book. Excitement flickered across her face as she stepped into the fabric, twirling before the mirror, while our mother hovered with approval. My camera flashed again and again, capturing every angle, the hem swirling the earrings at her ears, her smile sharp with victory. They didn't notice my hand slip into my purse, sending a carefully prepared email. The photos would not remain in our private family album. The following morning, my post went live across social media. I didn't write long captions, only one short line. "A bride deserves respect." The images spoke for themselves. My shoes before and after Kayla borrowed them, my once pristine purse with stains, my stretched sweater, and finally Kayla posing in my dress and our grandmother's earrings. Within minutes, the comments poured in. Friends from the studio, old classmates, even clients rallied in support. By midday, a new phrase began to trend: "bride, not bullied." I turned my phone face down, letting the notifications pile up unseen. When Diana walked past my desk later that morning, she glanced at my screen and gave a small, approving nod. "About time," she said quietly. That afternoon, I met Daniel at the bank. The evidence I had gathered, transfer receipts, vendor contracts, and detailed records of every payment spread across the polished surface of the manager's desk. I explained calmly that these funds had been given under false pretenses and asked to have them refunded to my account. The manager reviewed the documents, nodding slowly, then processed the transfer. Daniel sat beside me in silence, his hand resting on mine. When we walked out, I felt lighter knowing that my parents no longer had financial strings to pull. That evening, I called their house and left a simple message on the answering machine. My voice was steady as I told them the payments were settled and the wedding would proceed exactly as Daniel and I planned it. No room for discussion, no space for argument. The next morning, I went to my grandmother's and packed the after-party dress into an acid-free box, placing the velvet case with her earrings beside it. As I closed the lid, she watched from her armchair, her eyes knowing. "They'll be furious," she said softly. I smoothed my hand over the box. "Let them be," I answered. For once, I didn't care what storm followed. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed with steady preparation. Daniel's college friends agreed to serve as our quiet security team stationed at the venue to block interference. Tasha coordinated with vendors who now accepted instructions from me alone. At night, Daniel and I sat on the balcony with coffee, reviewing checklists, our laughter quiet but genuine. Each step we completed strengthened the walls I had built around our day. Still, I knew my family wouldn't arrive quietly. On the morning of the wedding, I arrived at the venue 3 hours early. Through the glass doors, I saw them already inside, my mother, gesturing wildly at the coordinator, my father waving papers in the air, and Kayla dressed in white, her gown suspiciously similar to mine. They insisted on a sister ceremony, calling it a family tradition. The coordinator looked flustered, caught between their voices and the contract in her hand. Daniel squeezed my fingers. Marcus and the others stood at the entrances, calm but unyielding, their suits blending in with the crowd. I drew in a breath and stepped inside. The coordinator turned to me with visible relief. "Miss Bennett, can you clarify?" she asked. I nodded and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "There is no sister ceremony. I am the bride." My parents' faces flushed with shock. Kayla's mouth opened in disbelief, but I didn't falter. I asked Marcus to ensure they remained in the designated family area until the ceremony began. My father tried to object, but I cut him off firmly. I said, and I am. 2 hours later, I stood in the bridal suite with my grandmother adjusting the veil. The lace gown flowed around me, every stitch holding steady against years of compromise. She smiled at my reflection, her voice trembling with pride. "You look magnificent, strong." Leah came in from the ceremony space, grinning as she reported my parents sitting in the front row, their expressions sour. "Kayla keeps trying to add flowers to her dress," she added with a laugh. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm settle over me. The processional music swelled, and I reached for my grandmother's arm. Together we stepped forward. The officiant's voice rang clear. "Today we gather to witness the union of Nora and Daniel only." The deliberate weight on the final word shifted the air in the room. My parents sat rigid. Kayla fidgeted with her imitation jewelry, but none of that mattered as I locked eyes with Daniel. The long walk down the aisle felt like reclaiming every step I had given away before. The ceremony ended with a stillness I hadn't expected. The officiant's words hung in the air, the applause rising, Daniel's smile holding me steady as we turned together down the aisle. The music swelled, flowers brushed against my dress, and for the first time in months, I felt my own steps belong fully to me. My parents stayed seated, their faces unreadable, while Kayla's hands twisted in her lap. It didn't matter. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged. No one could change that. At the reception, I slipped away briefly to change. When I emerged from the bridal suite, I wore the ivory satin after-party dress that Kayla had once tried to claim. My grandmother's earrings caught the chandelier light with each turn of my head. Evelyn touched the earring as she straightened the clasp, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "You reclaimed it." I met her eyes and answered everything. Together we walked into the hall where the celebration had already begun. Guests crowded the floor with laughter and conversation. At the family table, Kayla's face shifted between sulking and scheming, her fingers tapping impatiently against her glass. My mother's grip on her champagne flute was so tight her knuckles paled. The photographer circled the room, capturing both joy and tension without distinction. I raised my glass during the first toast, my voice carrying over the clink of silverware. "To those who respect us and support us," I said, raising my eyes toward Daniel, my grandmother, and Leah. I let the pause stretch, leaving the family table unacknowledged. Guests followed suit, lifting their glasses high. My parents' expressions stiffened as they drank anyway. The music started and the dance floor filled. I moved among friends and colleagues, each one stopping to congratulate us, their warmth steadying me against the undercurrent of family disapproval. But I noticed Kayla edging closer to the DJ booth, her eyes fixed on the microphone. My mother followed, whispering urgently to the wedding planner. I caught fragments. Sister toast? Tradition. But the planner shook her head firmly. Before Kayla could reach the microphone, Daniel's best man intercepted, smiling, as he blocked her path. "The bride's playlist is quite specific," he said lightly, steering her back toward her seat. The tension in the room eased, though I felt her eyes burning into me from across the floor. I crossed the distance and stopped in front of her. My words were quiet, but she heard them clearly. Not today. Not ever again. Her mouth opened, but no reply came. For once, she seemed to understand the boundary was real. I left her there, the music rising again around us. Later, near the cake table, my father pulled me aside with my mother close behind. They led me into a smaller side room, away from guests. My mother's eyes filled with practiced tears, dabbing them with a tissue as she accused me of humiliating them. My father's voice was sharp, warning me I would regret this public display. Their words overlapped, each one layered with the same refrain, "After all we've done for you." I stood still watching them, really seeing the patterns that had ruled my life until now. their demands, their tears, their authority that cracked when I refused to bend. I reached for my grandmother's earrings, adjusting them before speaking. "Thank you," I said evenly. They blinked, confused. "For showing me exactly who you are. Now I know exactly who I need to be." My father stepped closer, his face dark. "If you walk out that door," he began. I cut him off. "You'll what? Take my car, my inheritance, my wedding dress. You've been taking pieces of me my entire life. There's nothing left for you to claim." I opened the door and paused. "Enjoy the cake." I chose chocolate because it's the one flavor Kayla hates. Then I walked back into the celebration. The music swirled as I returned to the dance floor. Daniel found me quickly, his arms wrapping around me as we swayed together. Over his shoulder, I saw Evelyn laughing with his parents, her earrings glinting like shields. The photographer's flash caught her mid-smile, preserving the moment. As the song carried on, I let my head rest against Daniel's chest. The words of my parents still echoed faintly, but they no longer carried weight. The room around me, the friends, the laughter, the music was stronger. The rest of the evening unfolded without interruption. Guests lingered over dessert, children danced near the edge of the floor, and colleagues complimented every detail of the event. My parents remained seated, their posture rigid, Kayla silent beside them. Each attempt they made to interrupt had been turned aside, each demand left unanswered. By the time the final song played, they looked diminished. Their authority eroded not by confrontation, but by absence of control. When Daniel and I stepped outside at the end of the night, the air was cool, the stars faint above the city lights. Our friends cheered as we slipped into the car, the sound of their laughter trailing behind us. For the first time, I felt the weight of the day shift into something lighter. My parents had tried every tactic, and still the wedding remained mine. Yet I knew their anger would not stop at the reception doors. There would be fallout attempts to reclaim ground. But the lines had been drawn, and this time I would not retreat. The night after the reception, Daniel and I returned to our apartment well past midnight. I slipped off my shoes, finally free of the layers of lace and satin that had defined the day. The silence inside felt like a reprieve, a pocket of air untouched by family drama. We sat at the kitchen table in our wedding clothes, eating leftover cake with forks straight from the box, laughing quietly at the absurdity of it all. For a moment, it was just us. No interference, no whispers, no demands. But when the sun came up, so did the fallout. I woke to my phone buzzing with new notifications. Posts were circulating, online photos taken from the reception, cropped and captioned to paint me as cold, ungrateful, even cruel. Someone had written, "Imagine excluding your own sister on the most important day of your life." Dozens of strangers echoed the sentiment, none knowing what had really happened. I scrolled in silence until Daniel gently slid the phone from my hand. "Don't feed it," he said. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. My parents didn't wait long to escalate. That afternoon they called, voices raised before I could even say hello. My mother accused me of embarrassing the family, claiming people at church were shaken by my behavior. My father demanded an explanation for the public toast that left them out. "You humiliated us," he said. I listened, letting the words fall without answering. When he finally paused, I told them calmly that I no longer owed them explanations. The line went quiet for a long second before my mother hung up without a word. 2 days later, a letter arrived in the mail written in my father's hand. It was not an apology, but a warning. He wrote that choices had consequences, that family loyalty was not optional, that I had walked away from more than a wedding. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer without replying. The silence between us grew heavier, but instead of suffocating me, it gave me space to breathe. I poured myself into work at the studio. Clients were curious, some whispering about the news coverage, others offering quiet support. One afternoon, Valerie Torres stopped by again, this time, bringing flowers. She said the way I had handled my family inspired her followers, that people were rallying behind the idea of setting boundaries. I smiled politely, grateful for her kindness, though part of me wondered how my private life had become so public. Still, her words carried a kind of validation my parents never had. In the evenings, Daniel and I began planning the next chapter. We talked about leaving the city, about starting somewhere new, where the echoes of family disapproval couldn't reach so easily. He researched job transfers, and I looked at open retail spaces for a potential styling studio. The idea of distance grew more appealing each night as the calls from my parents turned sharper, their voices a mix of guilt and fury. They reminded me of childhood holidays, of school tuition, of every sacrifice they claimed to have made. I listened quietly, then ended the calls without argument. The boundaries held. One evening, my grandmother joined us for dinner. She had moved more slowly since the wedding, her knees stiff, but her mind was as sharp as ever. As we cleared the dishes, she opened a folder she had brought with her. Inside were the finalized estate papers naming me executor and primary beneficiary. My throat tightened as I read the words. She reached across the table, her hand steady on mine. "This family has a pattern," she said. "Generations of women told to give and give until nothing was left. You ended it." Daniel listened quietly, his arm around my shoulders. The weight of her words settled deep inside me, heavier than any accusation my parents had thrown. That week, Daniel and I found a rental house in Connecticut, 3 states away from the city and 800 miles from my parents. The bay window overlooked a lawn lined with maples that would turn red in the fall. We signed the lease within days, and the move followed quickly. When we stood in that new living room surrounded by boxes, the quiet was almost startling. No sudden doorbells, no uninvited voices filling the space. Only us. The distance didn't stop my parents from trying. Calls came less often, but when they did, the tone was sharp. My mother would open with a plea and close with a threat. My father would demand updates reminding me that family ties were not meant to be severed. Each time I kept my voice steady. "I'll call back next week," I said once. On my terms. They didn't like it, but they were learning that the rules had changed. 6 months later, the house felt fully ours. My grandmother had moved into a senior community just 10 minutes away, close enough for weekly dinners. She drove her old Buick slowly down our street one afternoon, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. She watched Daniel stir sauce on the stove, her eyes warm. Then she slid another folder toward me. "It's all finalized now," she said. Inside were papers naming me sole executor and confirming the trust. My eyes blurred as I read. She leaned closer. 4 generations of doormats," she said frankly, "until you." I held her hand, the truth of her words, anchoring me. One evening I stood in the bay window, watching autumn leaves scatter across the lawn. Daniel brought me a cup of coffee, his weekend socks sliding across the hardwood. "It's quiet here," I whispered. He kissed my temple and said, "That's the point." The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of space I had never been allowed before. The wedding had been mine. The house was ours. Yet I knew the final piece of closure hadn't come. My parents still lingered like shadows reaching across miles with guilt and silence. And soon one small package would arrive on our doorstep, carrying the last thread of the past I hadn't yet faced. The package came on a Tuesday afternoon, left on the porch without a return address. The handwriting on the label stopped me cold. It was my mother's. Inside was my old diary, the purple one I had filled as a teenager, with careful notes about borrowed clothes, missing jewelry, and things that never found their way back. Between the pages, a single sheet of paper slipped free. The message was short. Perhaps we should have listened. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't denial either. I placed the diary on a shelf where I would see it visible, but not central. A chapter closed, but not erased. The weeks after that moment carried a steadier rhythm. I opened a small styling studio downtown, the space filled with light from wide front windows and the scent of fresh paint still clinging to the walls. On the counter, I arranged magazines featuring a spread of my wedding look clients, calling it elegant and unshakable. Each time I saw those pages, I remembered the decision to stand firm the night I finally said no. A new client came in one afternoon, an actress who told me she had booked after seeing an influencer post about my work. "The way you set boundaries," she said, it resonated. I smiled, grateful but quiet, arranging fabrics as she spoke. At home, Daniel and I settled into routines that felt like freedom. Mornings began with coffee by the bay window, evenings with quiet dinners and long walks through our neighborhood. My grandmother visited often, her laughter filling the kitchen while Daniel cooked. She seemed lighter living close by, her stories flowing more easily, her eyes clear. One evening, she opened an old photo album, pages I had never seen before. In each picture, women in our family smiled with practiced patience, their younger sisters or brothers standing slightly ahead. She tapped the images with a knowing finger. 4 generations of stepping aside, she said, until you. The words settled in the air like truth finally spoken aloud. As Thanksgiving approached, Daniel and I extended our table with borrowed chairs. The house filled with the scent of rosemary, sage, and pies cooling on the counter. Leah brought flowers, my grandmother arranged them, and laughter rose as friends carried dishes to the table. When the phone rang in the study, I didn't move to answer. The caller ID showed my parents' number. My grandmother glanced at me knowingly. "Do you need to take that?" she asked. I shook my head. "Tomorrow," I said. "Today is for joy." She nodded, her smile approving. Dinner began with Daniel lifting his glass, his voice steady as he offered a toast. "To chosen family," he said. "To peace we fought to earn, and to the people who stood by us while we did." Glasses clinked around the table, the sound bright and full. I looked at the faces gathered, my grandmother's proud eyes, Leah's steady smile, Daniel's hand warm on mine. The absence of my parents was noticeable, but not painful. What mattered was the presence of those who had chosen to stand with me. Later that night, after dishes were washed and candles burned low, I stepped into the quiet of the bay window. Outside, the lawn was scattered with leaves, their colors fading into the first chill of winter. The diary rested on the shelf behind me, a reminder of what had been. My grandmother's folder lay safely in the drawer, the future of her estate no longer uncertain. For the first time in years, I felt no rush of dread at the thought of family gatherings or phone calls. Only calm, only clarity. Yet I knew one more step remained, not of confrontation, but of closure. My parents' silence since the package hinted at a shift, but I didn't know if it was resignation or preparation for another storm. Either way, I had no intention of giving ground. What lay ahead was no longer about them. It was about me, the life Daniel and I were building, and the peace we had claimed together. The morning after Thanksgiving, the house was still filled with the smell of herbs and pie. I sat by the bay window with a blanket across my lap, watching frost form on the edges of the glass. Daniel moved quietly through the kitchen, humming as he poured coffee. My grandmother's laughter from the night before still lingered in the air, joined by Leah's teasing and the warmth of friends who had chosen to be here. For the first time in years, a holiday had felt whole without my parents' presence, and I didn't miss the weight of their expectations. A week later, I stood in my studio arranging a display of scarves when a courier arrived with another envelope. This time it was legal documents confirming what my grandmother had set in motion months earlier. My role as executor and beneficiary was formalized. The weight of 4 generations of women who had been asked to step aside ended with me. I sat at my desk holding the papers, thinking of the diary my mother had sent, the single line she had written. Perhaps that was all she had to give. It didn't change what had been done, but it acknowledged it. I placed the envelope beside the diary on the shelf side by side, evidence of the past and the safeguard for the future. Work carried me forward. Clients came one by one, often women with their own stories of being overlooked, of giving too much. They didn't always say it outright, but I could see it in their eyes when they told me why they had come. The studio became more than a business. It was a place where I could show them what dignity looked like stitched into fabric, where they could see themselves reflected in a mirror without apology. Each fitting reminded me that standing firm had never been just about a dress or a wedding. It had been about claiming a life that was mine. At home, Daniel and I grew into our routines with ease. The quiet of Connecticut wrapped around us like a blanket. Our evenings were simple dinner by the fire, long talks on the porch when the nights were clear. My grandmother visited often, her Buick parked in the driveway as she settled into the kitchen, like she had always belonged here. Her hands trembled more now, but her voice never did. She would watch me move around the room, a faint smile on her lips. "You've built something, Nora," she said once, "not just a home, but a way of living." I knew exactly what she meant. I haven't spoken to my parents much since. Sometimes the phone rings, their number flashing on the screen. Sometimes I answer, sometimes I don't. When I do, the conversations are brief. They ask questions, test boundaries, hint at old debts. I keep my answers short, my tone calm. The calls end quickly. They've learned that silence follows when they push too far. I no longer carry the weight of their approval. My peace doesn't depend on it. Looking back now, I can see how much of my life was spent giving away small pieces of myself in the name of family harmony. A sweater, a pair of shoes, an entire career opportunity, all surrendered for the sake of keeping peace that was never truly mine. It took a wedding for me to understand that peace bought with silence is not peace at all. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks that only I control, doors that open when trust is earned and close when respect is lost. Learning that has changed everything. When I walk into my studio each morning, I pass the framed magazine spread of my wedding day look. It isn't there to boast. It's there to remind me of the moment I decided to reclaim what was mine. Each time I see it, I remember the words I spoke to my sister on the dance floor. Not today, not ever again, and I hold to them still. So if there's anything I've learned through all of this, it's that self-respect is never something to give away. Family, friends, even people you love will sometimes take more than they should. Saying no may bring anger. It may bring silence, but it also brings freedom. And once you taste that freedom, you can never go back. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If you've ever had to draw your own lines in the sand, I'd love to hear how you found the strength to do it. Share your story in the comments, and if this resonated, subscribe for more.